Evening, and welcome to our live webcast of Open Book, Open Mind online with Andrea Elliott talking about her new book, Invisible Child: Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. I'm Ariel Zeitlin, one of the librarians at Montclair Public Library. And first, I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A button. If you're using a computer or a smartphone, it's at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a tablet, it's at the top of your screen. That's how you can send us your questions for the Q&A, and it's also how you can ask for live tech help from my librarian co-host, Alex Russo, at any time during the webcast. Now, I'd like to introduce Gina Chung Fort, a member of the board of our Library Foundation. Welcome, Gina.
Thanks, Ariel. So good to see you guys. We're so happy you're here for another virtual webcast of Open Book, Open Mind. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Montclair Public Library Foundation. We're a group of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise money to fund the offerings that make our library so special. This includes library programs like this one, staff development, building restoration, and other needs that aren't covered by city funding. Your donations support everything from laptop lending, Wi-Fi hotspots for Montclair residents without internet access, to lifelong learning classes, homework tutoring and resume help, to the children's reading programs, and most recently, the significant growth in e-content during the pandemic. So after you enjoy this event, please make a donation through our website, montclairplf.org. Gifts of all sizes have an impact, and the library needs your support now more than ever. Thank you very much, and please enjoy the program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all that you do, Gina. And if anyone in the audience wants to contribute to the library in other ways, please search for Friends of the Montclair Public Library on our website or on Facebook. So tonight, we're delighted to welcome Andrea Elliott, a longtime investigative journalist for the New York Times. Andrea won the Pulitzer Prize for her series, An Imam in America, and the George Polk Award for the highly influential 5-part New York Times series on which she based Invisible Child. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
You may already have read about Invisible Child. There was an excerpt that appeared on the cover of the New York Times Magazine last month. The book has been getting great reviews. Newsweek said it was destined to become a classic in its genre, and it's available to buy from our program partner, Watchung Booksellers, or to borrow through the library. Once again, here we are, Invisible Child. Now, I'm also very pleased to introduce Andrea's conversation partner, Lydia Polgreen, the head of Gimlet Media, which produces award-winning podcasts. Lydia is the former editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post and spent many years before that at the New York Times, where she served as editorial director of New York Times Global and also the West Africa bureau chief. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you, Ariel. It's great to be here.
Okay, well, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. And for everybody at home, please remember that you can start submitting your questions while the conversation is going on. I'll be back at the end after all the questions are done.
Great. Andrea, it's wonderful to be here with you. I feel like we have to reveal to everyone here that you and I have known each other for a very long time. We were young Metro reporters together at the New York Times. Almost it'll be 20 years ago next year. It's wonderful to be here to talk with you. This book is a remarkable achievement, and I can't wait to have a conversation about it. But why don't we kick off with you reading from the book?
Okay, thanks so much, Lydia. It feels like old times and new times here with you. Here's a section that comes pretty early on in this book. To know Dasani, Joni, LaShawn, Coates, to follow this child's life from her first breaths in a Brooklyn hospital to the bloom of adulthood is to reckon with the story of New York City and beyond its borders with America itself. It is a story that begins at the dawn of the 21st century in a global financial capital riven by inequality. It is also a story that reaches back in time to one Black family making its way through history from slavery to the Jim Crow South and then the Great Migration's passage north. There is no separating Dasani's childhood from that of her matriarchs, her grandmother Joni and her mother Chanel. Their fleeting triumphs and deepest sorrows are, in Dasani's word, my heart. The ground beneath her feet once belonged to them. Her city is paved over theirs. It was in Brooklyn that Chanel was also named for a fancy sounding bottle spotted in a magazine in 1978. Back then, from the ghetto's isolated corners, a perfume ad was the portal to a better place. Today, Dasani lives surrounded by wealth, whether she's peering into the boho chic shops near her shelter or surfing the internet on Auburn's shared computer. She sees out to a world that rarely sees her. To see Dasani is to see all the places of her life, from the corridors of school to the emergency rooms of hospitals to the crowded vestibules of family court and welfare. Some places are more felt than seen. The place of homelessness, of sisterhood, of a mother-child bond that nothing can break. They dwell within Dasani wherever she goes. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that, Andrea. Let's start with I mean, you've been working on this project and first met Dasani. It's almost 10 years ago now. I'd love to hear a little bit about what drew you to the subject of homeless children and how you found Dasani. What was so special about her?
So this is what I feel to be probably the deepest immersion of my reporting life. It's a deeply human story. And yet it really began with a statistic. That's the funny part. So backing up, I went back and reread Alex Kotlowitz's There Are No Children Here, which was a book from the 80s, capturing a very different experience of child poverty in Chicago. And this was 2012. And I was just asking myself, like, how much has really changed? And I started to research stuff and came upon the statistic that 1 in 5 children in America are growing up poor. And it turns out that that's exact same statistic as when Kotlowitz's book came out. It's as if the needle hadn't moved. Of course, it moved a little bit, but we were in the same place. And it's now 1 in 7. And so that just kind of set me down this path. And I wanted to find a New York story because I do best reporting where I can immerse. And as a mother of 2 young children at that point, I thought I wanted to be realistic. And I looked far and wide. My editors, Matt Purdy and Christine Kay, and I did a lot of thinking about this. But ultimately, by the time I landed at the entrance of the Auburn shelter, all the sort of ideas of what the story should be, even the demographic checklists that I had kind of guiding me went out the window, because by then I had interviewed so many kids. And for example, my mother's from Chile. I speak Spanish. I was quite intent for a while on writing about a Hispanic kid, and it made a lot of sense. But by the time I met Dasani, really all that mattered was finding a child who could narrate her experience of what it was like to be her and who gave life to that story. And she was just someone who immediately drew me in. It's like everything that came out of her mouth, I wanted to write down. Actually, one of the first things I wrote down was, my name is Dasani, like the water. And, you know, she just had such a sense, she had such a presence. This was a girl who wanted to go to the Olympics as a runner. She was the fastest runner on the block. Everyone knew this kid. She was on the honor roll. She just like brimmed with aspiration and hope. And it was easy in the beginning to kind of see her as a star and as this just like, oh, this is a kid who big things are going to happen for. what you don't see talking to Dasani standing outside her shelter, and it took months for the photographer Ruth Fremson and I to get inside because it was closed to the public, was this incredible burden that she was carrying every day, of living crammed in one room with her 9 family members, dealing with mice and roaches and mold and hunger and interrupted sleep, which is a huge issue just there. I mean, any one of these, there's another passage where I talk about this, but any one of these afflictions could kind of derail a kid like Dasani. Just the fact that you're hungry every day. A lot of children suffer in America. It's 1 in 8 from hunger insecurity or food insecurity. She had parents who were struggling with depression and self-medicating. Often they were working their programs, but when they relapsed with drugs, she had 7 siblings to take care of. She had huge, by the time most kids in New York City were waking up to go to school, she'd been working for 2 hours just to like hold her family together and get the kids out the door and fed and dressed. And yet she was still filled with all this promise. And that contrast between what could be her life and what was her life was the thing that I think kept me invested as a reporter for many years, just interested and eager to watch what would happen. How do you reconcile, just such an unfair set of troubles with such immense promise, and ultimately, I think what her story and the New York Times excerpt is just a fraction of this story, and it's a long arc. I think what it does is it pushes us to question how we define success and who gets to have it and at what price, because I've come to see it very differently after these 8 years. Now that's a good mouthful as a beginning.
Yeah, no, but I mean,
Sorry.
But it's funny. I mean, we're having this conversation. I actually live in Fort Greene, as you know. You've been to my apartment, not very far at all from the shelter where you first met Dasani, and where her and her mother Chanel and stepfather Supreme and her siblings lived. Sort of paint a picture for us. I mean, and I think one of the things that's really remarkable in the book is that you sort of paint the picture of the contemporary situation that the family finds themselves in, but actually Auburn was a particularly resonant place for this family because they had a very, very specific connection to it, and a very specific connection to the neighborhood going back a long ways. So tell me about sort of the family in Fort Greene and the history of particularly the matriarch, Joni and Chanel, and this kind of extraordinary American story of the family that Dasani came from.
Yeah, so the current snapshot is very much Dasani living in this decrepit city-run shelter just blocks from townhouses that are being renovated and flipped and sold for millions. And Fort Greene is also many things in between those two extremes. It's a really fascinating tapestry of different experiences, and made famous by among many people, Spike Lee, and just a tremendous presence of artists. What's interesting about even my own introduction to Dasani was that when one sort of encountered her in that moment, which was 2012. She'd been living at the shelter for 3 years. It would be easy to kind of dismiss her as one of the many random homeless kind of transplants in the neighborhood who are just passing through, although she'd been there for a while, but who didn't have any connection to the neighborhood, and that the people who were truly stakeholders there were many among them people who had come in the last decade and planted roots and invested and been part of this meteoric gentrification that had taken hold of the neighborhood. And in that period, which was basically the bookends of that period, are Dasani's birth and where she was when I met her at age 11. Also the bookends of Bloomberg's terms as mayor. It's a really interesting period because in that first 10 years of this new century, you saw in Fort Greene the portion of white residents jump by 80%. And in that same period, according to one ethnographer, and is a pretty significant study on this, roughly 3/4 of Black-owned businesses closed in the same neighborhood. So this was just a massive moment of like change, and it's easy when so much change is occurring to forget what what existed before. And the more I got to know Dasani, the more I accidentally encountered her history. It would come up in random comments, or some family member would say something, and what ultimately came to life in this book and was the fact that she went back, even though she was homeless, even though she just happened to be randomly assigned to Auburn, she arguably was more of a Fort Greene stakeholder than anyone there, in the sense that she went back 4 generations. This was a neighborhood that had one of the first major public housing projects. It was Fort Greene houses, and then it got split into 2, Ingersoll and Whitman. And her great-grandfather, who'd come up from the Great Depression after fighting in Italy when the military was still segregated, as a Buffalo soldier, surviving 3 major battles in Italy, coming home with 3 Bronze Service Stars and other medals, and then coming up north as a trained mechanic, found himself in the 50s in Brooklyn, in a place where not only redlining had made it impossible for Black families to become homeowners in the way that white families were going to the suburbs, made it impossible for him to follow his fellow white veterans into the suburbs, because even though he was entitled to the same GI Bill supports, there were so many racist barriers keeping him from things like getting into college, voting. I mean, it just was one thing after the next, and he wound up working, cobbling together a living over the next 30 years while his family sort of disintegrated survived, but struggled mightily with the lack of a social safety net that white families were able to build by virtue of this discovery of the suburbs and investment in housing, which we know the story. But what's so interesting about Dasani's arc, I think, is that you see generation after generation in this neighborhood, this incredible, especially among the matriarchs, her great grandmother, and then her grandmother, and then her mother, this just constant march forward and an attempt at transcending the problems that came before each person, and yet this inability to, by virtue of the systemic barriers that kept them from better work, from education, from even just clean air, things like that. And it was Cumberland Hospital, public hospital. That's where Joni was born. That became the shelter where Dasani wound up. And the echoes of the past just kind of followed Dasani through this book and through Brooklyn. It's just this constant reminder that there is a history and also a pattern, a cycle that is playing out. And it's not just a cycle of poverty. This is one thing that I started to feel very strongly about as I was writing this, is that we talk about poverty in this kind of limited way, I think, the cycle of poverty and how to break the cycle. But there's also very much a cycle of power there, and of strength, and of family bonds. And I think that's almost the most central thing about her story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if I were to take away one thing from this book, it's the centrality of the family as a unit of power, of social power, right? And how central that is. So I want to kind of get into that question of family and what ends up happening, because I think we look at children in these situations, and we look at families, and we think that everything that happens to people are it's largely related to personal choices that people make, and we look at individuals and we say, why didn't they make this choice, or why didn't they make that choice? And I think one of the things that really struck me about the narrative of this book is just how little freedom and how few choices people in the situation that this family are in actually have. So I want to focus in on Dasani and this decision point that she faces when she gets into this very, very special school. And the decision is, does she go or does she not go? And sort of what comes from that. So bring us up to how Dasani ended up leaving home.
So her public school principal, Paula Holmes, started to lose faith in the public school system as a route of salvation for Dasani, not for kids in general. And I think for a lot of kids, she saw incredible transcendence and social mobility happening through the school system. I mean, one thing I will say just about the public school system is that this is so much more than school. This is everything for a kid like Dasani. School is arguably one of the greatest anti-poverty program that exists. And it's because even before the educating part of it begins, there's so much other stuff that it is providing for a kid like Dasani. First and foremost, not just surrogate parents, but shelter, food, sometimes even things in some schools in New York City like laundry. I mean, this is a parallel home, and it's a haven. But for Dasani, given the problems of her parents and the size of her family, the composition, which was a large family, a very, very united family, a family that impressed me always by the bond and the discipline with which they even just walked through the street. It's always sticking together, always operating as a collective. You never put yourself first. You exist entirely within this broader framework. You don't see, it was such I think of Dasani as the protagonist of this book, but the family as the universe of her life and the most important system of survival, the critical one. But Holmes, the principal, felt that Dasani needed to get away from her family in order to have a chance at something better. And she had tried to get other kids into this school called the Milton Hershey School, Milton Hershey, which is named after the chocolate magnate in Pennsylvania, who started this school for children in need. It's the richest private school in America with a more than $17 billion endowment. And it's a kind of fascinating place. Some people think it's an incredible kind of case study in how to transform children from poverty backgrounds. Others find some of the practices there to be disturbing or frustrating. Kids who have graduated, the population of alumni, it's a very proud bunch. So you hear many different things, but it's 2,000 kids divided among these homes, each one run by a married couple. And they are given everything that they lacked in their prior environment. So full wardrobe, swimming lessons, driving lessons, braces, and they're taught a different way of behaving, of even speaking. And so Dasani found herself one day to the next in a radically different, predominantly white town in a rural place. Even the air to her smelled and felt different. That's what she said. And she underwent this kind of really incredible transformation that she felt in the beginning, of just a certain quiet in her mind, a peace, an ability to, she was unburdened. This noise of her former environment was lifted, and she could do things like run track on a team and excel. And she skipped ahead 2 grade levels in math pretty quickly with tutoring, and she was thriving. But in her absence, her family, which had depended very much on every cog in that wheel, suddenly had what I would argue the strongest cog had left. She was always, and this is one thing about kids who leave poverty often, is the children who are the most that seem to be the most promising or have this like very, very strong skill set also tend to be the kids who are most indispensable to their parents. And then so that's also a tension. She left, things fell apart, and the children wound up in foster care. And that was the greatest crisis of Dasani's life, was just trying to kind of survive the guilt of
Yeah. Well, and I think the reason I brought in Hershey now is that I think that there's this kind of core tension in the book that there is, the family is clearly a source of tremendous strength, but it's also a source of tremendous stress, particularly for children. And you see scene after scene of Dasani and her sister Aviana and others in the other kids in the family basically taking on the role of parent, taking on the role of caretaker, of provider, and there is this fundamental tension of if in that environment where you have parents that are struggling with addiction, or dealing with intergenerational trauma, dealing with poverty, is it better ultimately for for those children to remain in that environment because the love and the strength that comes with being with your family, or as Paula Holmes said, does this child need to be in a different environment in order to thrive? And I think the really sort of brilliant and nuanced thing about the book is that it doesn't give you any easy answers to that question, right? It's
no
really
easy
kind
answers
of a
to anything.
Yes.
Basically, the drumbeat of the book is no easy answers. Everything is utterly complicated. I have so much to say about this, Lydia. I love the framing of this question. I think family is first and foremost, and remains throughout this book, the ultimate source of strength. I don't see family as a source of stress. I think there are stressors on this family that make parenting impossible sometimes. I think of, and I'll just say, we know addiction cuts across class lines. I have a sibling who has struggled, and you know about him, all his life with a very serious addiction. And just to see Dasani's parents having kind of survived major childhood traumas and lacking the resources that other families have, lacking a chance to go to like a really, really strong rehab program, for instance, that is therapeutically based. I mean, they've had some of that, but it's mostly been really up to them to survive the addictions and stay sober, and they have struggled all their lives. It's funny, when I set out to write this book, part of it was what you were saying earlier. We talk about personal responsibility. When it comes to the poor, it's easily politicized and people like to assign blame, and it's easier to also walk away from the problems when you think of them as being caused by someone like Chanel or Supreme, and that the family is the problem. And so my pitch to the Times was, look, wherever you are on the political spectrum, you can't argue that 16 million children in America who are being raised in poverty right now are responsible for their own choices, or that they are responsible for getting out, that they got themselves into this mess. And yet they are in this mess, and the stakes are very high, because we know what happens to children who are raised in adversity. The outcomes are actually, you could argue, very costly, right? I mean, they are. We think of programs as costing a lot, but the absence of interventions leading to teenage pregnancy, dropping out of high school, a greater likelihood of incarceration. These are very costly outcomes. And so,
I think at one point in the book, you say that the total cost of foster care for the children was like $400,000 a year. I mean, it was extraordinary that you sort of added it all up.
It is probably the single statistic that I would most want people to take away. And I'm so glad you remembered that. $33,000 a month, nearly $400,000 a year, that the government, federal, state, and city, began spending on this family once the children were removed from their parents. If you'd just taken a fraction of that and used it to support the parents in the ways that they desperately needed, their children were removed on neglect charges. The vast majority of families in this situation face those charges, not allegations, I should say. It's a different system, not abuse. So this is not a situation where parents wanted to inflict physical harm on their kids. It's that they failed to provide adequate housing and these were problems that were they are often closely correlated to poverty. So, you think about our investments, and it's just very, very important to see that. And I'm glad you took that away. But the kids, going back to, I want to write about kids because kids are not responsible. Let's get this away from the adults. What I came to see, and I think that it's why I stayed with this book for so long, and why the book reaches back in time and tries to tell multiple narratives in order to explain Dasani, is that you cannot understand Dasani without understanding Chanel, and you cannot understand Chanel without understanding Joni. You can't, in each of these adults exists a former child. And so children exist in us, right? And we're all former children. And the idea that I could only write about the kids was a kind of, it was a very reductionist view. When I look back on that, like a almost naive, let me just get out of this problem by focusing on the kids. And what always happened with Dasani is she showed me the story. She just would consistently kind of lead me into a different direction and force me to look at it in a different way. And so to understand the problems of the adults, you have to look at their childhoods. And those were childhoods that deserved different outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that that was really striking to me in the book is that, after Dasani goes away to the Hershey Milton school, which, that's like getting the golden ticket, right? It's like this extraordinary thing. Back home in Staten Island, there starts this kind of slide of events it's just like it's like watching a train wreck happen. And, some of it is, Chanel not complying with getting drug tested and things like that, which in and of itself is like, a kind of invasion of her privacy and so on and so forth. But I think it's also just the kind of, shocking crudeness and rigidity of these like systems that all kind of conspire on one another. I mean, the sequence of events that lead to, a family living in a house, children together with their parents, having support like food stamps and things like that, and sort of holding it together, to just completely being smashed to smithereens is I mean, it really is like watching this slow motion disaster. Can you just walk us through what happened and why, and why did you want to kind of illuminate that? What did you want people to take away from it?
I was just trying so often to make sense in real time of things that I was shocked by. I entered into this book thinking I was writing about a homeless kid. Each label that is assigned to Dasani is a description of a current plight, but it's really just a signpost to something much deeper. And when you start to mine the depths of each of these labels and look at what is her poverty about? Well, actually it goes all the way back to, if you really want to understand it, you got to go back to her great-grandfather. We went from DHS, these are the acronyms of her life, the systems that are in the book, and they were as confusing to me as they are to the family and to anyone else, including Dasani's teacher, who's one of the great heroines of this book, Faith Hester, who, as she puts it, got gentrified out of Bed-Stuy and wound up in the shelter system herself and was homeless for a year while teaching full-time. She's like, I have 2 master's degrees. We were in welfare one day together. She was correcting the grammar on the signs. She's like, should I tell them? I don't know if I should tell them. She's a remarkable woman, but she said, I have 2 master's degrees and I can't figure out how the hell this thing works. It's so confusing. So for a long time, I struggled with that. I just was like, you know what? My job is, the reporting was, we wound up getting more than 14,000 records. I work a lot with audio and video, 132 hours, I think, of audio, 27 hours of video. But I wasn't quite clear on how all of this was going to come together and what it was going to show. I just knew that I didn't understand it. And we went from the Department of Homeless Services to Dasani being a foster kid. This is ACS, new acronym, to other ones, including HRA, which is welfare, DOC, which is Department of Corrections. one day I said to Dasani, she could see I was stressed out. She said, "What's wrong?" I said, "I'm trying to write this history of welfare, and it's hard because it's just hard. I want to bring it to life, but nobody can explain to me how these systems interact. If I were to do a map, what would it look like?" And she closed her eyes and she said, "DHS Bronx, HRA Queens, ACS Brooklyn." And that map, by the way, is in the beginning of this book. And I think it's one of the most important documents, or sort of like, I don't know what to even, it's a map, and it's more than a map. It's Dasani's way of seeing, and many children, tens of thousands of poor people in New York, their way of seeing the city is mapped out in it's a parallel map. And these are punitive systems. They are systems that are filled with complexity. There are many miracles that happen in these systems every day. It depends on who you get and who's on the front lines. But I think ultimately what happened to the family is that when Dasani left, and this is what so often happens, I think, to poor families, is it's not one big thing. It's a small thing that then snowballs into something bigger and something bigger, and then suddenly you've got a catastrophe on your hands. The small thing was, although it's a very poignant thing, it was a very big moment emotionally, I thought, but it was that her little brother Papa, 5 days after she left for Hershey, was watching the new Annie, identified with Annie, thought about Dasani, thought about how Dasani had left, and decided to run away. And he disappeared for a few hours on the streets of Staten Island. He didn't have a coat on. He was picked up by an ambulance. I was there that day. I showed up after that happened, and I went to the hospital with Chanel and Khalik, his brother. And by then he'd been sedated and was chained to a bed, and they were calling child protection. That there began a new investigation. The family had been under the watch of this agency for years. Once they're in your life, a lot of things can go wrong. Chanel was frustrated. They kept coming to the home and noticing that there were, this is Section 8 housing, and the landlords weren't fixing things. And so there were leaks, and eventually the bathroom began to fall apart. And she was removed from the home on the suspicion that she was using drugs. She became homeless, and suddenly Supreme, her husband, was in charge of 7 of the children, Dasani being away. These 7 were in his charge. A lot of different things happened, but ultimately what broke the family was that the agency that was monitoring them decided that the condition of the home presented a threat to their well-being. And it's partly because there's a vast system of mandated reporting. Anyone who works with children is a mandated reporter, and you are required by law to call the child abuse hotline and say if you think anything is going on with a kid. And it could be the kid comes into school. I'll never forget the principal in that neighborhood in Stapleton who said, "Here's how I fight poverty. These kids come into school, they have a laundry pile up at home, so they don't wear socks. Their feet begin to smell terribly, especially in summer. That can lead to a call about hygiene, which is a form of neglect, which then cascades into potentially the kid landing in foster care. So what am I going to do? I'm going to hand out socks."
Yeah.
That's my answer. It's very simple. He was really opposed to the way that ACS managed its cases in his school. And of course, one of those cases became this family's. And, at the end of the day, I mean, it was just that they hadn't fixed things in the house, even though they had been calling. And I did document this, and it was just a brutal, and as you put it, I described it, I remember at the time, like it's like watching a slow motion train wreck.
Yeah.
Wheels just coming off. And
yeah. And, you remove Chanel from the home, on suspicion that she's using drugs. And that means that this one man has to watch all these children by himself. He's calling 311 to try and get the house, fixed. And that ends up backfiring, and, her food stamps don't get transferred to him, so he can't feed the children. She ends up in jail. Just it really is like watching a horror movie, and you just think, my God, what can happen next? And what's crazy is that all of these well-intentioned people, or, some of them are great, some of them are incompetent, who are sort of part of this alphabet soup of acronyms, they sort of push almost inevitably to and inexorably to this conclusion where the family is destroyed, and I don't know that that's anybody's intention, from the beginning, but
no, I definitely think like ACS would never say that that's its goal. And I mean, look, there's the agency in New York City, there are agencies across the country, obviously, that do the same thing, but New York City is known for investing more in prevention, which is the program that's
totally, yeah,
than anywhere else. But it's nobody wants to see a kid taken away. And I saw judges again and again in the transcripts and also in real life saying this is the last thing we want. They know the trauma. It is, as you and I have talked about, Lydia, I mean, it's an act of violence to remove a child from that child's parent. Almost always it is the worst thing that can happen. It's obviously sometimes necessary, but those cases are such a small fraction. I mean, that year, 2015, 93% of the cases involved allegations of neglect only, not abuse. So of course we don't want children to be in danger. Nobody wants to see a calamity. The problem is that that small fraction of cases tends to dominate the news, of course, and then everything else is sort of shaped by that. And it's a very fearful system.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that idea of like removing children from their families as violence has, is often weighed in the public imagination against that, New York Post or New York Daily News horror story, that every few years you see about some horrific, physical or sexual abuse that happens to a child. Tell us, and I want to go to the Q&A, but bring us up to date on where Dasani is now. She, I'm sure a lot of folks if they haven't read the book, which absolutely you should. This is an instant classic. But if you've read the Times Magazine story, you'll know that she ends up leaving Hershey, sort of self-expelling in a way. From Hershey, getting into fights and things like that. But it's funny, the way that you play it in the book, it doesn't read as a tragedy, it doesn't read as like a disaster that this is. And in fact, I think for me anyway, and I won't spoil the ending of the book for anyone, it does end on for me what feels like a pretty hopeful note. But bring us up to date with where Dasani is today.
So Dasani returned home and repatriated, I would say, herself to her city and her family. She felt that to, as she put it, talk white, act white. These are the things that she felt she was being asked to do at Hershey, was to disavow her own culture, of course, which she was very, very proud of, and her own way of speaking, her own way of self-expression, of being true to herself, and of feeling close to the people who mattered, and keeping even the spirits of her past alive within her, Joni in particular. That was much more important to her, to stay rooted in her. And this is what's also so interesting. I, again, started out thinking this is a homeless girl. At the end of the day, what I would say is Dasani's without a home, but she's the least homeless person I've ever met in New York City. She has such a deep sense of belonging. As she put it to me, home is the streets where I grew up. It's the people who've had my back since day one. It isn't a roof over my head. That was what she needed. And her answer for her life is not about departing that place to get to something better, to what a lot of mainstream America would consider success, and the way that it's defined as a middle class, not the opposite of Dasani's neighborhood, a place that most people are employed, not unemployed, potentially married, owning homes, having fulfilling careers, having completed a 4-year college. She would like all of those things. She doesn't feel that she has to leave in order to get them. She would like to have them where she is. And that's what she's trying for. So she's living after a long battle in court. Her mother won back custody of 3 of the children. They're living together in a rental, and Dasani is in community college now, and she's studying business administration, and her life continues to take ups and downs, just like in the book. But I think the hope in the book rests within her. It is not about, of course, one hopes that a lot will change for poor children in America in terms of everything from the delivery of services to the way that we even approach or think about poverty. So many assumptions that we carry are wrong. And I was just constantly surprised in my time spent with this family. And I can give you lots of examples of that. But, you know, I think a key one is the idea that her parents are chronically unemployed. They are working every day of their lives. They're just not working in the way that we might recognize as being part of the formal labor market. It might look more like bartering, but it is survival. It is absolutely imperative that you figure out a way to put food on the table every day. It's, you know, so also this idea that poor families like hers don't want to work, or that they actually want to rely on the government. This is such a common perception people have the poor. This is a family where 2 of the children qualified for disability. Ultimately, when they were foster kids, wound up getting those benefits. But while they were with the parents didn't want to apply for this benefit, even though it would have brought in a lot of cash potentially, because they felt that it, like a lot of parents might feel, that it would give their kids a stigma. And they wanted their kids to not see themselves as disabled because they had a learning disability. They didn't want them to feel that they were starting out life already with a mark against them. There's just so many ways in which I think her story challenges us to question our assumptions and think differently, think out of the box.
Yeah, no, it's truly a human story. I'm going to go to some of the questions in the Q&A. And please, folks, I know we've got a lot of people on this Zoom, so please do add your questions, and we'll try to take as many as we can. First up from Leah Lesser. This is fabulous. Thank you. From a big fan in Boston. I have a few questions. Understand if you can't get to all. First up is, what was your biggest surprise in getting to know Dasani?
There are so many. Oh, what was my biggest surprise? I think, I guess one of the greatest surprises was how I stopped seeing her. Like, so in the beginning, what I saw her as was this kind of emblem of hope, and that we would follow her out of her hardship into some other place, because she was all about that. You know, she'd wake up every morning, go to her window, look out and look at the Empire State Building. And she did that because, as she told me, and as any New Yorker knows, the tower lights make the building different colors depending on what's going on. She said, it always makes me feel like there's something going on out there. And I just expected her to pursue that vision of success, which meant leaving. And I think, again, like, that's just so ingrained in how we see the story that we're supposed to celebrate of the kid who made it out, rather than all the kids who don't necessarily make it out, but who are just as capable. And she's one of them. And I think, like, maybe I just came into this thinking, no, but she's got such incredible, as did Paula Holmes and everyone who saw her, promise and spunk and originality and talent, so many gifts as a dancer, as a runner, as a thinker. She's gonna, of course, find some way around or through or to transcend these obstacles. And I think, like, what wound up being the surprise, and it's so obvious in retrospect, is that the obstacles are greater than any one kid's promise. They basically are. It requires a lightning strike, I think, of luck to get out.
I mean, I think that's a very American thing, right? To believe that, you know, just through extraordinary will and extraordinary talent, one person can break through. There are a few questions in here that ask about your sort of how your relationship with Dasani evolved, and we'll get to those. But I think undergirding that is just a question about the reporting process. This was not a traditional, I'm going to stand in a corner and take notes, right? Like you had to, you were and are in these folks' lives in a very, very deep and immersive way. And I'm sure, and you write about this in the book and the afterword and things about balancing that relationship, that kind of having some journalistic distance, but then also understanding that like you're part of the story. You become part of the story in some ways. So how did this, tell us about the reporting process? What was it like?
Yeah.
And you're a parent of young children. You're obviously seeing great suffering. How do you cope with all that?
I'm not sure that I have a good answer. Did I cope? I think I did. Here I am. I would say that I entered into this with a kind of like very traditional still view. I mean, you and I were on Metro together, and we both had come up from Florida. I mean, I'd cut my teeth as a night cops reporter at the Miami Herald and doing courts and stuff. And then we were on Metro, and it's funny. It's like you look back at the which remains the same ethical guide today for the newsroom. And it's these rules that are very important to protecting the integrity of our work, but that don't really give a roadmap to someone who's doing deep immersion over a long period of time. There are not a lot of guides in the newsroom for how to do that. And I found that with my colleagues, I could get guidance. But in the very beginning, I think because I entered into this relationship with that sort of, I'm a reporter kind of hat on, you are the person I'm writing about, here are the rules. That kind of created a framework from the very beginning that was useful because I was working for someone else and I could essentially say, well, that's their rules. And then sometimes I would play with those rules because, for example, city hall reporters take their sources out to eat at quite fine establishments, and I wasn't doing that. And then I thought, well, they're my sources. Why can't I take them to a decent place for a hamburger? And I remember Chanel rolling her eyes because the hamburger was like $15 and she thought that was outrageous. And, here, how can you spend the money taking us to eat, but not just give it to us? Well, we can't. And here are the rules. And we would have all these debates and I would repeat myself and the script that was drilled into me. And at the same time, in my gut, I just I felt this is so much more complicated than I'm making it sound. I know that it's, in a sense, I'm here as a reporter. This is my job, which I'm receiving a paycheck for as a reporter, to write about your poverty. I mean, it was this glaring kind of like, what? And it's funny. So when I left to go on book leave and entered into this new realm of let's continue with the same rules, but now it's going to be longer. I thought it was only going to be 2 years. It wound up being almost a decade. My where I started to find answers was among academics and mostly ethnographers, because they've just given so much thought to this. And of course, I mean, this is what they do, right? It's not as typical among journalists. And so my favorite person, the late Leanne Fuji, who had spent time with the victims of genocide, we talked about it a lot. I had fellowships that made this book possible. And one of them was at Russell Sage, and we would have these long kind of coffee clutches where we would talk about how impossible this weighing of these two roles feels, right? I'm there as a worker, and I'm also a human being, and I'm not going to deny that I'm either. I have to make space for both of them to coexist. She and I kind of would talk about this, and I loved what her frame was, which was ultimately that you have to understand going into this, that there is a built-in asymmetry of power. and nothing is going to change that. You have to know it. You have to know that it is such a privilege and such a huge responsibility, right, that you carry with writing, especially about vulnerable communities. And I think it's just the answer ends up being to just never stop feeling a little, I don't want to say tortured, but always wrestling with it. And also, I would say, I came to see my own vulnerability as a human being, not as a weakness, but as a strength. I came to see that being attuned to my own humanity while reporting and being awake to that was essential to putting the story on the page in a way that would matter for people. And I can't think of anything else that mattered more in terms of my role, was making the story work, making it reach people and move them in the way that it was moving me. If I wasn't moved, how was it going to move them? I was there the day that the children were taken. I watched it. It's the first scene in this book. I feel that I don't want to spend 1 second of this precious platform talking about my own pain, because imagine what it was like to be them. But of course, you see something like that and it changes you. And I'm it's something that I'm going to be thinking about, hopefully writing about for a long time, is this kind of work, because I think it's so important.
Mm.
And we need better guidance, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sort of, how you affect something by observing it is a theme in some of the questions. Michael asks, how do you think Dasani's life and transformation was affected by your relationship with her? And you've answered that partly, but I think, there were obviously, when the first series ran, there was a huge outpouring. She became a kind of political figure in a way, or a prop. So just talk about that impact.
She did become she had a moment of fame, and it quickly dissipated. People offered donations, because our response often to poverty is, I want to just unburden myself of this discomfort I'm feeling and this ache, having read this story. How do I do that? Hurricane happens, let's give money. It's just an immediate human impulse, much the way that we love the story of the kid who made it out, because again, it's like, well, if you just have enough willpower, and therefore we don't have to really reckon with the problems that are keeping so many there. I saw this money go into this trust, which still exists and is very important to the future of these children. There are 8 of them, and they need to go to college. And I plan, should the book bring proceeds, to, of course, donate. And I didn't talk about that until after I was done, because I felt it was very important to guard that, not only that boundary, but in terms of my own profession, but also thinking back on my conversations with Leanne and other ethnographers, to not make it seem to the family like this was the reason to participate, that they had to feel they were doing this really with their with a great sense of agency and willingness and wanting their story to be known, rather than feeling that they needed to or had to, or that there was something waiting. But of course, those thoughts were probably there, and we avoided a lot of those conversations in the process. Only had them after, and I let them know that I'm doing this. Invisible Child Trust is on Twitter. I just want to say that. But what happened with the trust is that, because Chanel and Supreme were struggling with addiction, the trust decided to to be really careful with that money, and not to have it impact the parents' benefits by giving them cash or anything. So it's going to college. It's funny, I've thought a lot about how did my presence affect what happened? What were the major things that may have happened, turned out differently? And I even talked about this with Dasani yesterday, because somebody else had asked me, and eventually she will talk herself directly, but she gave me this quote, because I said, someone wanted to know, Dasani, how would your life have been different if the New York Times series never happened? She wrote, well, I feel I still would have accomplished certain goals in my life, like graduating or playing sports. And then she and I started texting back and forth. I was like, but I remember when the series ran And people were like, oh, she's just being used by these politicians who are putting her on the mayoral inaugural stage in 2014 and holding her up as this beacon of hope. They're saying this about you. And remember, Dasani, what you said, and what she said to me was, I don't agree. I think I was inspiring people. I still look back on that period and I see that I was inspiring people. What's really interesting is what she said yesterday. She said, building on that, she said, maybe the way that this impacted my life is that I kept remembering that I am an inspiration. And maybe that steered her in other ways. She said, it changed my life by letting me see to never let hardship stop you or push you back in life. Take that and use it as fuel to do better things. I mean, what I would often say to Chanel, when Chanel and I would talk, her mom, about my role, she'd say, well, you're the author. What are you going to do with that? I said, I'm the author of the book, but you're the author of your life. What are you going to do with it? I mean, of course, somebody was watching me for 8 years. First of all, I would never summon the bravery that required. I am sure would be constantly running through the back of my mind. Should I do this differently? I don't know. I can't say how my presence, absence of presence would have affected things differently. But I would never for a moment take from Dasani's own sense of accomplishments. I think she got into Hershey because she was a very, very promising candidate. Did they see a media opportunity? Possibly. But I know that it was very hard to get access and I had to fight really hard for that. I agree with Lydia that this isn't entirely a sitting in the corner with your notebook kind of experience, but so much of it was because of just like the sheer amount of time, right? Hours and hours and hours and hours together. You have to be willing to be, there was one moment recently where I fell asleep and Dasani took a picture of me asleep on the bench in the intake office that I had snuck into of homeless services with her mom. We were both asleep. I would show you the picture, except Chanel hates it because she says she looks terrible, but I look terrible too. We're knocked out. People were sleeping constantly in all of these agencies, buildings. They were so exhausted by the wait. I think that just walking with them, being with them, sometimes falling asleep with them out of just sheer exhaustion was as much a part of the reporting as writing something down, right? And I could never know what it feels truly, of course not, to be them. But what I do see as my role was to walk with them, which is different but important.
Yeah. The other big relationship obviously is with Chanel. And I'm curious, like, how did you win her trust and confidence? And then how has that relationship evolved over the years? She's such an extraordinary character in the book, and just a really striking figure.
She said to me early on, if you weren't a mother, I wouldn't have let you near my children. I think that's where the road to trust began. I don't see trust as a destination. I see it as a constant work in progress. I think it ebbs and flows. We had some really tough moments. The bond was and remains a deep one. I was there with her the night after her children were removed. It's just, and days after that, right, together, just, it's a really, really important relationship to the book and for my work as a reporter, but it's also, I saw Chanel really often as a kind of almost like a teacher to me. She was constantly translating to me experiences that I might have otherwise not understood. And I think that I did ultimately win enough trust to, there's almost nothing that she didn't share with me. And she was so brave in that sense. She once described the experience of being reported on by me as having an autopsy while you're still alive. Every single organ is being examined. It's like, that's horrible. She said it laughing. She's like, it's like, you've just figured out everything about my body. But really, it's the records. We had thousands and thousands of records of I know, and at any given day, what was happening to her, because to be poor is to be surveilled. that's the thing. If I was writing about a very wealthy family, there would be probably no records, right? Very, very little paper trail. With the poor, you have massive paper trails because every day is accounted for either through these various agencies. It's incredible what you can see. But yeah, she was an extraordinarily important influence in the way I saw things. I'll never forget one time Chanel saying to me, I think this is just an example of millions, and I think it's in the book, but she said, you know, poor people, we don't want a white Christmas. I was like thinking, like, why not? Like a white Christmas, everyone wants a white Christmas. No, because we don't have the shoes for it. And she said, like this year, I'm going to find myself doing what I do every year, which is stepping in the footsteps in the boot prints of other people to avoid getting my feet wet. Just things like that. It was just this constant education.
Yeah, I mean, it's really striking because I think both Chanel and Dasani are like extraordinary storytellers and extraordinary narrators of their own experience, and also noticers of the things around them. You know, it's really remarkable. Michael asks, have you talked to Alex Kotlowitz and about your experience and compared notes?
I did very early on. And I really want to have a conversation now with him and be able to do that in a public way. I mean, he is an icon, you know, to me. But really, it was more just very, very early on conversation about sort of leaving the newsroom and going into book writing. He may not even remember it, but he did read the book and loved it and was very generous in how he talked about it. So
yeah, for those who might not remember from the beginning of the conversation, Alex Kotlowitz is the author of There Are No Children Here, which is right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, There Are No Children.
Okay.
Yes.
Which I think was a really big foundational influence for Andrea in taking on this project. So Susan asks, if people in the New York City bureaucracy were willing to listen to your suggestions, what would be the top 3? For example, rent-free housing, or an apprenticeship program, et cetera.
Yeah. So I say this with, you know, just bear in mind that I'm not a policymaker. I'm a journalist, and I think there are such incredibly smart people working on these problems always, and whether their solutions you know, wind up being seeing the light of day or not is a different matter, and you know, it's a very flawed process. But so I can just offer observations from being on the ground, which the first thing I would say is, you know, federal government spends 10 times the amount on programs that separate children from their parents in the foster care realm I'm talking about, rather than programs that prevent this. And if I saw one thing that was surprising, or maybe there's just one big takeaway about the importance of family in Dasani's life, it's that the family and parents in particular are often seen as a problem, as something to kind of navigate around, an obstacle to social mobility for children. I see it really differently. I think you could look at Dasani's family and see dysfunction. And I still would challenge anyone to read this book and think that it was the right thing for those children to be removed. What could look like a dysfunctional family is almost always a family worth keeping together. And so few of our resources treat families like a worthy program, an asset, the way that we treat other things. Let's invest in education. Let's invest in families. And this seems like such a basic thing, but if you look at what happened to Chanel and Supreme, the wheels would come off when they didn't have cash, when they weren't able to feed their children, when they were tangled up in some kind of bureaucratic welfare hurdle, and suddenly the lights were out. They needed just such basic material supports, the kind that we are seeing now with the child tax credit. It's lifted 3.5 million kids out of poverty on a month-to-month basis in every study that I've seen of late. And it's kind of astonishing, because just that very basic, I think there's a sense that you can't trust poor families with money, or, I disagree. I've seen what happens with this family when there is a steady income versus there isn't. And I think that the family, needed a lot of supports. But another example, so putting aside child protection, is supportive housing. That's expensive. It's wraparound services. So this is low-income housing for families that usually involves a service like, there will be a social worker on the premises and a counselor. It's costly, but not as costly as what happens when children wind up being removed from their homes. And I think that's the thing to weigh more than anything, is just what is more costly for us. And I don't think people think of it that way. I think they think of homes of poverty as flawed places, and that children need to be rescued from those places and put into this other system. And it's just astounding when you look at the research, how clear it is that that is a downward trajectory for kids. It is not the answer. It's
Yeah.
mostly, I mean, Linda Lowe, who is a caseworker in this book, and a very brave soul, because she went on the record to talk about the system in a way that I think was really risky for her. She said, if you just took a fraction of the money that we spend separating families and you put it towards, if we had just put someone in the home, and she got to know the family very well, if we just put a home health aide there, she said, I think of it sometimes like I'm driving and I look in the rear view mirror and I see a police car behind me. It might cause me to just slow down a little bit, check am I speeding? No. Am I going to stop fully at the red light? It's not that they were doing anything wrong, but the idea that there's somebody there to support them, to help them draw a bath, to remind them that the appointment is coming. That is a fraction of the cost of what wound up happening. That was far more traumatic also for the children. Devastating, life-changing, that they lost their home and their parents. So I just think there's a lot to explore there. And then, of course, the third thing is education. We can just talk about that all day, but we need, obviously, I think kids need just much greater supports than they're getting. And I want to say something about the library, Montclair, and give to your library. The library in this book is another refuge. Whitman, it is an essential, it's such an important place of shelter, of providing opportunities for kids. And we need libraries. We need these public institutions. So
Yeah.
I know that there's a funding push, and I just wanted to make sure that we all keep Montclair in mind.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful place to close. Andrea, thank you so much for writing this extraordinary book and for all the work that you do. I can't wait to see what you do next. I'm going to hand it back over to Ariel.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this important, eye-opening, sometimes heart-rending discussion. It's really been a privilege to have you both here, and thank you so much for your support of the library too. We appreciate that. And I want to thank everybody here in the audience, because as I always say, without you, we're nothing. And we here at the library are all about giving it away. But I just want to remember, this is my moment to remind you that, there's a book here, and it's a really excellent book. And if you want to support the authors who come to these programs, like Andrea, and you want books like this to go out into the world, and you want authors to want to come back to Open Book, Open Mind, please consider buying their book, their books. Invisible Child is available for sale by our partner, Watchung Booksellers, our local independent bookseller, and it's also available to borrow through the library. The greatest compliment that you can pay an author is to want to own a copy of their book. So finally, we hope that you will join us for our next event with Gail Jessup White, who's the author of a new memoir coming out, Reclamation, Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and a descendant's search for her family's lasting legacy, on Thursday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. Be well, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye for now.